able to speak to Professor Noam Chomsky on a wide range of questions coming from our members. These topics went from JFK to anarchism and even healthcare to history censorship. He's the father of modern linguistics, Professor Emeritus at MIT. He's the author of well over 100 books. He's a world-renowned and leading dissident. He is a huge critic of U.S. foreign policy, and he specializes on a wide range of topics such as history, politics, technology, freedom of speech, socio-economic systems, philosophy and ethics, media, propaganda, psychology, and the list goes on. If you're interested in learning more about him and his work, you can check out his webpage. You're able to purchase any number of his books. You can find him all over YouTube with different talks and even clips covering many different social studies related topics. And you can even find some major video work online, such as Requiem for the American Dream, Manufacturing Consent, and even a Vietnam debate on firing line. We were very grateful to have such a high-profile figure like Noam Chomsky on, and someone who is really a wealth of knowledge on different social studies related topics. I hope you all enjoy the talk, and be sure to check out more of his work. Hello, Professor Chomsky.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Good.
So this is our history club, a bunch of different students, grades 9 through 12. It was great to see that some are big fans, and we meet with different guest speakers, and we're excited to talk to you. We live in Shamokin. It's kind of a poor area, and it's an old coal mining town. So there's a lot of interesting history, and yeah, we're just excited to talk to you. So,
okay, great. Glad to be with you.
Would you like us to just get into questions, or is there anything that
Sure.
you like?
Why don't you just raise questions about what you're interested in instead of my talking about what's on my mind?
Well, they're excited for just your mind too, but yeah, we'll have a lot of questions.
Okay, let's go. Somebody break the ice.
I'll break the ice with one kid that had basketball practice. He was unable to make it. He did a whole project on JFK and the history, and a lot of kids asked about your take on conspiracy theories in general and the JFK one, because he did a ton of research. Obviously, these files are still being leaked. He checked out Oliver Stone's stuff. I'm not sure how you feel about all that, but
Sure.
that could be one to break the ice.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two different kinds of questions about the JFK assassination. One is the question, who carried it out, who killed him, and how was that done? That's one question. It's like a question about any other murder that took place. Who did it? Why'd they do it? How was it done? And so on. So the fact that he was a president doesn't change that question. It's just the forensic question that a police investigation would try to answer. The other question is, did it have an impact on policy and society? It's a separate question. What was the effect of the assassination? Was it a high-level assassination that had policy consequences? That's a different question. About the first question, who did it, why'd they do it, and so on, I don't have any particular opinion. I don't see any reason much to question the standard story that it was Oswald and did it for whatever reason he did. But if that's wrong, okay, so it's wrong. Let's find out who did do it. As far as I can see, it's like any other crime. You want to know who did it, why, who was responsible. But I have no special insight into that. The so-called conspiracy theories are mostly about that. In fact, almost all about that. And so you can look into them and decide what you think. The other question is the one that interests me, and I've written a lot about it. In fact, was it a high-level plot with policy consequences? Well, you can check that. Take a look at the policies before and after, take a look at his positions and so on. And in my own view, I've written about it extensively, if you're interested in looking into it, is that it basically had no serious policy consequences. Policies continued as they were, same people carrying them out. There are a lot of, if you look at the theories about the assassination, Oliver Stone, many others, they're all motivated and based on the idea that somehow this changed the world and changed policy, and Kennedy was going to do all sorts of wonderful things, and he was killed to try to prevent him from doing them. Well, we don't have any reason to believe he was planning to do any wonderful things or anything different from what was done. The main issue is that point the Vietnam War was raging, and there's a huge industry trying to show that Kennedy was planning to end the war, and he was killed to prevent him from doing that. There's not a particle of evidence for that. We have a huge documentary record, internal record, planning, everything. It turns out that Kennedy himself was sort of towards the hawkish end of his administration. He was certainly willing to end the war, but he insisted after victory, after the United States wins the war, takes over South Vietnam, puts in the regime that we want, and if it's stable, then we can pull out. He never veered from that up until the day of the assassination. And the policies that were then carried out were by his advisors, and they continued the same way. There were claims that he was planning to do sorts of things about world peace, but there's no evidence for it. I mean, you can believe it if you like, but it's basically based on faith. So my own view, at least, and as I say, I've written extensively about it if you want to look into it, but my own conclusion is that it was not a high-level conspiracy with policy consequences as to who killed him, who carried it out. I have no special insight. I haven't looked, in fact, I've read many of the theories, but they're conceivable, but I don't think they're very convincing. In fact, the Warren Commission, the official commission, that's not all that convincing either, but you expect that. I mean, if you look at investigations of questions like this, it's not very easy to determine. They're, unless, even if you look at the court cases for a killing, there are always lots of questions. Life is not a simple matter. You rarely have absolutely definitive evidence. It's one of the many reasons, I think, why my feeling is the United States should join most of the rest of the world and ban the death sentence. The United States is one of the few countries that has the death sentence. I don't think it's legitimate. And we have many cases where people have been in jail for 50 years on death row, and then it turned out they were not guilty. There's something called the Innocence Project, run, I think, by a law school in Chicago, which has used the DNA and other techniques to investigate convictions by methods that weren't available at the time. And it turned out a fair number of cases of false conviction, even when the evidence looked circumstantial evidence looked moderately convincing. But that's a different question.
Other questions, guys? Just make sure you speak up.
Is there any correlation between difference of language and culture when it comes to the political beliefs of people?
Well, that's a question that has been studied for almost a century. There's an idea, it's called somehow called the Whorf hypothesis, Benjamin Lee Whorf, which is that your language determines the way you perceive and understand the world. And sounds plausible on the surface, but it's been very hard to find any experimental evidence for it, except in very superficial ways. So, for example, there are languages that draw the color spectrum is divided somewhat differently, not totally differently, in different languages. So some languages don't have a distinction between orange and red, let's say. They just use the same word for both orange and red. And it turns out if you do perceptual experiments and you present people with a stimulus that's on the red-orange border, close to one or close, turns out that if you ask them later what they saw, people in a language like ours, which distinguishes them, will remember better what they saw than people with no distinction. But that's almost trivial. When we saw something that was red, we coded in our minds as red, so we'll remember. But who cares? But it's hard to find anything much beyond that. There's been a lot of efforts, and there is debate and discussion about it. So it's not a settled question by any means. But for things like perception and so on, very little evidence. What about beyond that? Do people have a different conception of one of the early proposals that was by Whorf himself, which was considered very significant? He was studying the Hopi language and culture, and he argued that they have a different conception of time. All of us think of time as kind of like a line, with ourselves standing at one point on the line, looking forward to the future, looking backward to the past. He argued that the Hopi don't think of it that way because they don't have past, present, and future in their language. They think about it in some relativistic terms and so on. Problem with that proposal is that English doesn't have past, present, and future. We don't have future tense in English. If you want to talk about the future, you use what's called a modal word, like will or shall, which is just one of a class of modals: may, might, can, will, shall. So if you apply his reasoning, we shouldn't have the conception that we do have. And as far as we know, that Hopi have the same conception. It's so that just collapsed, and other efforts have been made, and they haven't been very successful. When we get to your point, social and political consequences, it's very hard to find anything. It's even for simple perceptual things, it's hard. There's a lot of loose talk about these topics, but when you look into them, the arguments don't make much sense, and it's very hard to find evidence. But I don't think there's any particular reason that we know of to think that there are social and political consequences to the language that we use. You could have totally different languages and have the same social political systems. In fact, that's true to an extent. Take the United States. There are people whose first language is different. Take my parents, for example. My father grew up in the Ukraine. His first language was Yiddish. It's the language of Jews in the Ukraine, Eastern Europe. But he had the same, he came to the United States when he was 17. So he's already grown. But he had the same he lived in the United States the same way anybody else did. I'm sure you know people who have immigrant backgrounds who have different, whose native language is different, but they live in the same society we do.
So I wanted to ask because it's to my understanding that you consider yourself an anarchist, right? Which is on the left side of the spectrum. I know it's kind of a like touch topic. People don't like to look too much into the spectrum, but I was wondering if you could explain what your definition of anarchism is, or like where exactly you consider yourself to be, like your viewpoint on it, and how exactly you.
Well, at its root, anarchism grew out of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism collapsed because it ran into capitalism. Capitalism is inconsistent with liberal ideas, classical liberal ideas. Capitalism is based on the principle that for most of your waking life, you should be a servant who follows a master. That's called having a job. Suppose you have a job in a factory or a McDonald's or wherever. Most of your waking life is spent following orders. And the orders are very strict. What you can wear, when you're allowed to go to the restroom, who you're allowed to talk to, what motions you have to make, and so on. If you're working in an Amazon warehouse, what path you have to go through to get the fastest way from here to there, and so on. So that's capitalism. It's based on the idea that there are masters and servants. You look back at labor history, US labor history in the 19th century, when the industrial system was established, working people were bitterly opposed to it. It was an attack on their rights and their dignity to have to follow orders. Having a job was called wage slavery. This was such a common idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. The Republican Party then was nothing like what it is today. The Republican Party in Lincoln's day, one of its principles was that wage labor is intolerable. It's an intolerable attack on rights and freedom. People can be wage laborers only temporarily until they can regain their freedom somehow. That was a standard conception of American working people in the 19th century. Capitalism had to be imposed by force. And in fact, if you look back at US history, the United States has a very violent labor history, much more so than other comparable countries. Until the late 1930s, workers were being murdered by security forces in labor actions. It didn't happen anywhere else in the advanced countries, at least. We have a violent labor history, and in fact, the modern period since Reagan, one of the major goals of the government has been to destroy the labor movement in many different ways. What's called neoliberal globalization under Clinton, the way it was designed, was basically designed to undermine American labor. And this goes way back. So capitalism was inconsistent with liberal ideas, liberal humane conceptions. Working people hated it. Finally, they've come to accept it, but I think opposition is right below the surface. Well, what's anarchism? Anarchism says, let's take the traditional ideas that authority, hierarchy, domination are illegitimate and have a burden of proof. They have to prove their legitimacy, show that we're legitimate. Well, sometimes you can do that. Like if I'm walking down the street with my grandchild and the kid runs into the street and I grab his arm and pull him back, that's authority. But I think you can give an argument for it. But any kind of dominance or authority, whether it's in the family, whether it's patriarchal family, parents and children, schools, social systems, economic structures, and so on, political systems, unless authority can be justified, it should be eliminated. And it can very rarely be justified when you think it through, any more than employment can. Well, anarchism just says, when you find illegitimate authority, let's dismantle it and move towards a more free, just social arrangement. My own feeling is that almost everybody's an anarchist when they think about it, when they think about the kinds of structures of authority and domination that they accept and ask, should we accept them? Is there a justification for them? There very rarely is. You can think that through for yourself. What kinds of authority, domination, and hierarchy are legitimate? And if they're not, you should be doing something to work to get rid of them. That's basically anarchism.
Touching into something you mentioned at the end there, could you give some examples of legitimized authority or like just authority?
I suppose let's take indigenous American society. If there was a conflict between two tribes, which turned into a war, a tribe would pick a leader to determine how the fighting should proceed during the war. But they'd be picked. And then when it's over, they have no more authority. But during the period of the war, you could say that's legitimate authority, I think. You could argue about it, but I think so. And there are other cases of legitimate authority. So suppose you had a democratic society. Our society is very limited democracy, but a true democratic society in which decisions about the nature of what's happening are made by the public in public deliberation, public thought, and then you pick somebody to administer your decisions. Well, submitting to the authority of the administrator may make some sense, may be legitimate, as long as they're under popular control. There are other structures which I think can be regarded as legitimate. So a class, like say your classes in school, there's a hierarchical relation, but I think it's legitimate as long as the educational authorities themselves are basically picked by a democratic public and kept when they're performing the tasks that they were chosen for. Then you can say, well, under these circumstances, I'll accept the position of authority. It's useful. That's teacher knows things I want to learn, so fine, I'll go along with it. So I think you can find plenty of structures in society that are legitimate, but most of them aren't. A lot of the ones we take for granted, like having a job, I agree with the 19th century Republican Party. That seems to me illegitimate.
So in a society like America's, right, where it's considered a capitalist structure, how do you suggest we move away from something like capitalism and into something like syndicalism or like anarchism, where we kind of think away from these governments?
Well, there are about 6,000 enterprises in the United States with value a couple $1 trillion, which are owned and run by the workforce. That's a step towards it. So instead of being somebody who follows the order of a master. You yourselves, the workforce themselves, runs the enterprise in a democratic fashion. It's not very much developed or cooperatives. Cooperatives work sort of the same way. People like a farming community can set up cooperatives for planting, marketing, and so on, where that's a step toward, all of these are steps towards democratic societies, societies where decisions that matter to people are made by the people themselves. We don't really have, our political system is not like that. And if you look at the way the political system works, it's basically run by concentrated private power. Take something as simple as medical care. In most countries of the world, medical care is just considered a right. You look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, healthcare is considered a right, like a right to food and so on. The United States is an outlier. We don't have universal medical care. Actually, we have it in a sense. We have the worst kind you can imagine. If you're injured or you're ill and you don't have enough money for the private system, you can go to the emergency room in the nearby hospital, and they'll take care of you if they can, maybe give you good care. That's our universal medical system. It's the cruelest, most expensive one that you can imagine. The cruelty is obvious. If you go to an ER in your local hospital, you'll probably see plenty of people there who basically need a nurse practitioner, but can't get to see a doctor because they can't afford it and don't have health insurance. So they sit around there for a couple of days until someone takes care of them. It's very expensive. U.S. Health costs are about twice as high as comparable countries and have some of the worst outcomes. You look at infant mortality and other measures, we're down at the bottom. But that's because we're an unusually capitalist society. The population generally favors universal health care, but you can't get it through Congress because the people in Congress are basically paid by donors, and they don't want universal health care. They want private systems that make profit for the rich and powerful. And this is very strong in American society. So you take sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better, but the last 40 years since Reagan have been unusually severe. There are even some measures of it. So one of the major research institutions, the Rand Corporation, quite conservative, part of basically quasi-governmental, recently did a study on how much money was, as they put it, transferred, I'd say robbed, but how much money was transferred from the lower 90% of the income the spectrum to the top 1% since Reagan. It's about $50 trillion basically stolen from the large majority of the population, put in the pockets of the super rich and the corporate structure. That's pretty effective highway robbery, $50 trillion out of your pockets. Well, that's the result of having a social and political system that's dominated by concentrated private power, which essentially, if you look at, there are very good studies of this. Turns out you can predict elections, electability with remarkable precision just by looking at campaign funding. And campaign funding mostly comes from the very rich, the corporate structure. There's good studies on this in mainstream political science. Turns out that if you look at these studies carefully, about 70% of the population in the United States is simply not represented in Congress, in the sense that there's almost no relation between the attitudes and desires of the voters and their own representatives. Virtually no correlation. As you move up the income scale, you get closer relations. When you get to the very top, they're the ones who basically buy the representatives. That's an extreme distortion of political democracy. It's not that we have none. I mean, it's not a totalitarian state. You can have a lot of freedom, a lot of things you can do, but the United States is unusually moves in this capitalist direction. And you see that in a lot of things. Like, it takes something as simple as maternal leave, care for a mother after birth. Every society has paid maternal leave. Poor societies, Mexico, everybody. There's the only country that doesn't is the United States. No guaranteed maternal leave. I mean, somebody may have it by accident or by insurance, but you don't have it guaranteed. Aside from the United States and a couple of Pacific islands, everybody has it. Or take, say, a paid vacation. Americans work on average about a month more a year than comparable societies, because they have paid vacation. We don't. Guaranteed, you may get it by accident. You know, maybe your employer grants it, but it's not required. Well, we're just kind of off the spectrum in that respect. And that's because of the unusual power of private capital, which is much more than in most other comparable societies. It's not always been like this. Like during the New Deal period, when I was growing up, there were changes in the opposite direction. And they lasted through the early post-war period. But when you get to Reagan and since, they're gone, declined seriously. So there are variations, but the basic structure of the society has what I would regard, you can make your own judgments, as illegitimate structures of authority and domination. But, you know, think it through yourself and think what you... But it's interesting that a lot of what the public wants, they just can't get, because it can't get through the Congress and executive, which is largely dominated by private capital, like universal health care, for example.
So we have about 6 minutes, 50 seconds left. I wanted to run through a couple of questions that we try to ask every speaker. And it's okay if you can only answer one, don't feel like rushed at all.
Okay.
It does abruptly just hang up. So, you know, when there's like a minute left, I'll talk to you and let you know. But your favorite part of history and why?
Can't say. I find almost every part of history, including prehistoric human life, very fascinating. We're an interesting species. In fact, one of the most interesting books I've read recently is David Graeber's book on prehistory, prehistorical societies, very rich and complex.
So why is it that you're so interested and fascinated by everything then?
Because human beings are quite interesting. Biologists sometimes say that every species is unique, but humans are the uniquest of all. Now, there's no other species, for example, that can do what we're doing right now. It's kind of a very interesting fact if you think about it, because humans arrived on Earth very recently. Humans emerged maybe a couple 100,000 years ago. in evolutionary time. That's like the blink of an eye, but we're radically different from every other species in all sorts of ways. For example, we're the only species that has language or anything like thought, reasoning capacity. I mean, I got a couple of dogs happen to be sitting under the desk right now. They do all kind of complicated and interesting things, but nothing like what any infant can do. We're just a very special species. And it's quite fascinating to find out what's special about us.
Why would you say history is important?
Well, if we want to understand, I'm not the only one who does. Take the Republican Party today. They think history is very important, so important that it has to be banned. One of the top policy programs of the Republican Party is to ban the teaching of history. It was an executive order from Trump. It's on being legislated by states. Teachers are not allowed to teach American history. The argument is it's divisive. It makes some people feel uncomfortable. Yeah, that's what history is. History isn't in nice fairy tales. It's the truth of what happened in the society and why the society is the way it is today. And those who are basically fascist in mentality don't want it taught. So they understand why history is important, and we should understand too. What they're trying to ban is what we ought to try to know.
Can you be more specific maybe like history?
More specific? Yeah. There are two, the United States has had 400 years of brutal, harsh treatment of Afro-Americans, a couple hundred years of sheer slavery, followed by a period which was scholars sometimes call slavery by another name, the Jim Crow period, up until the 1960s. It's not that far back. Federal housing banned blacks. Black workers couldn't own a house, and it comes right up to today. Well, that's a core part of American history. The Republican Party is trying to ban it. They don't want you to know that because it's divisive. That's one example. What about indigenous history? I mean, there was a rich, complex indigenous society before the white colonists came. We wiped it out. It's a total genocide. Well, we should learn about that. That's our history. We want to know about contemporary history. Take, say, Kennedy again. Kennedy radically escalated the war in Vietnam. It led to a war in which millions of people were killed, and 3 countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, were practically destroyed. Should we know something about that? Yeah, I think so. We want to know our position in the world, how the world looks at us, why they do. We should know about those things. Oh, you could just say, well, let's just repeat patriotic slogans and forget about everything. Okay, that's a possibility. Or we could try to understand ourselves, who we are, why we are this way, how we got this way, what we can do to change it, what we can do to make a better world. Those are 2 choices. You make your own.
So we have less than 1 minute, probably about 50 seconds. What's your advice to high school history students? And do you have any resources to share to help us?
There are plenty of resources, documentation, oral history, tons of it. The lesson is use your minds, critical minds. Think about the doctrines that that you hear and that are imposed, challenge them, question them, Maybe some of them are right, maybe some of them are wrong, but try to find out what kind of society we live in. Why is it this way? Can we make it better? That's the job of history.
Thank you so much for meeting with us, Professor Chomsky.
Good to talk to you.
So much. Thank you.